couldn't figure this one out. I tried to make sense out of it and got nowhere. But the real brain twister came the next day. You sprang it on me, Crusader, after office hours, when you caught me down in the lobby of the building.
Walter, just a minute.
Hello, Crusader.
Just hang on to your hat, Walter.
What for?
Oh, nothing much. The double indemnity case just busted wide open.
How do you mean?
The things showed, that's how.
What things?
The things that kept the release from being perfect.
I was scared stiff, Keys. Maybe you were playing cat and mouse with me. Maybe you knew all along I was the mastering engineer. I had to find out. I knew where to look. In your office.
Memo to Mr. Norton. Confidential. Criterion double indemnity file. With regard to your proposal to put Criterion under observation, I disagree absolutely. I've investigated their disc before, and it's the same processing as before. In addition to this, I have known double indemnity intimately for my lifetime, and I personally vouch for it without reservation. Furthermore, no connection whatsoever has been established between the new and old picture transfers, whereas I am now able to report that such a connection has been established between the audio transfers on different releases. Criterion has performed some new audio work on this new transfer. We have succeeded in identifying presentations on past video releases. We have checked their aspects on the night of the crime, and have found that they cannot be accounted for. I am preparing a more detailed video history report for your consideration. It is my belief that we already have sufficient evidence against Criterion and Universal to justify audio remuxing action. I strongly urge that this whole matter be turned over to the office of the fan editor. Respectfully, damn fool idealistic Crusader.
Hello and welcome back to this damn fully dualistic crusade. This video is a video history of Double Indemnity from its initial primary studio releases, which date back to 1987 with Universal. This being a Universal title, it of course follows the same sort of history on video releases as most classic films, and actually pretty much the same sort of trajectory as a lot of their Hitchcock titles in terms of the first major video release was tied into the late 80s period of Universal releases on VHS, Beta to a lesser extent, and Laserdisc, and then usually one would come out first, and then the other formats would come out with the same artwork and then the same master with no real extras or supplements outside of the trailer and perhaps some images. And then the Laserdisc would get branded the Encore Edition, sometimes see a reissue, and then the VHS version would usually see a number of reprints until Universal would go in and either tweak the master or do a new master and then do successive releases on VHS and sometimes Laserdisc through the rest of the 90s up until the DVD era when they basically restarted their whole catalog approach. So that means for this film, the first major release is actually 1987 and of course has the green artwork on the VHS release. There is also a beta version of this, but it is on the rarer side, but otherwise would be identical to what's here on the VHS version in terms of the transfer and overall presentation, just with format differences. Now, there's no real information about what source was used, but the original negative for the film is long gone, and the recent 4K master and restoration had to use a variety of sources. But looking at that information there, they do describe a copy being made of a fine grain element, which no longer exists, and that this copy was made in and around 1986. So my guess is that this element is what was used for all of these early video releases, because these have wear, they're obviously from a print source, but they look quite good for considering the era and time, and obviously something had to be generated to then be able to make a solid video master out of. So as the first major video releases from Universal only came out in 1987, just after this copy was made, my guess is that all of these early video editions are coming from this duplicate of a fine-grained master that, again, has deteriorated since, and this fine-grained copy was used to fill in gaps and help pad out the new 4K version. So it's still being used and still of use to this day in 2023, but if you do like a sort of vintage feel in terms of your presentation, you are going to get a nice experience on these early releases. Now, again, the tape versions came out in 1987, and then slightly thereafter, late 87 into 88, we got the Laserdisc iteration with the same cover artwork. So here is the 1988 Laserdisc. It has the same artwork as is typical of Universal releases of this time as the tape versions, right down to having the key art still sized for VHS primarily. It looks quite nice, and its original poster imagery, but I've never quite understood the green choice on these, but all Universal artwork is like this at this time period. But of course, this is part of the Gene Shalit Critics' Choice line, which you will see certain printings of these on VHS and Laserdisc, where you have the film frames of Gene Shalit reactions on the bottom. So this has become rather infamous in the world of VHS and Laserdisc collecting as one of those things we just, we all like Gene Shalit for being Gene Shalit, but it's not necessarily what you need on a video cover, especially for Double Indemnity, but it's kind of strangely endearing in a way. So if you ever watch copies from this era, or you remember having copies from this era, this will be very familiar to you, the sort of Gene Shalit reaction banner on the bottom. But otherwise, this is exactly the same as what you get on the VHS tape, just obviously expanded for the Laserdisc dimensions and in the typical style of the era. And excuse my finger, I got this copy originally from somebody else, and they have their number and address on here, so I just was covering up. I don't know if it's their current number or anything, but I just figured I'd do that anyway. So if you wondered why I'm holding it so oddly, but as you can see, it's basically just resized from the VHS dimensions. But of course, in classic Universal style, for all of their early and most of their Laserdisc period, we get the chapters of no chapters. And the only chapter is at the very end of the film on side 2, where we do get the original trailer included. So at least this does include the trailer. So this is a single disc CLV only title. It is the same master as the tape versions, so you do get the increased quality of Laserdisc, and this does look quite nice. But this is earlier Universal, so unfortunately it's analog audio only. So all of these have the original mono mix seemingly coming from this same print source. It sounds good and relatively unmanipulated, and that's why this source is still really the best thing we have on home video for the film's original audio, because it's not really messed with all that much. It does have some inherent defects, but it also seems to be the same relative base source that has been cleaned up and manipulated time and time again after this point, even including the new Criterion UHD release. So, unfortunately, this original Laserdisc pressing is one of those where, because it's analog audio, technically the tape versions, such as the VHS Hi-Fi track, are actually technically superior, because VHS Hi-Fi is a technically better format than Laserdisc analog. However, Universal would come around to actually addressing this with their next reissue of the film, because they did sometimes revisit films that had a simpler earlier release that definitely needed spiffing up because they were some of the most iconic titles in the Universal library. They never went and made them full special editions or anything, but sometimes you got a Laserdisc that had a slightly spiffed up reissue. So in 1991, we got the Encore Edition reissue, still with the original poster art and still the exact same master. And Universal did this on certain titles where typically they would just repress the same disc and give it an encore jacket. For example, they did this with the original Todd Browning 1931 Dracula, where they took the disc from the late 80s, which was the first restoration attempt, and just reprinted that same disc with a updated jacket with the same key art as the iconic Classic Monster Collection VHS run from the early 90s, and gave it the Encore banner. But they didn't give it a digital soundtrack, so it's basically the same disc, so it's just a rarer variant in terms of it's just harder to find, and it has the updated cover, but otherwise the disc is the same. Well, Double Indemnity is one of the rare cases where they basically did that, but importantly, they did add a digital soundtrack, and annoyingly, it's not listed anywhere. So you would think this is just another repressing because it's the same master, but this does have a digital PCM soundtrack, and it's the same relatively untouched track that was on the previous 1987 and 1988 releases. So that makes this particular 1991 Laserdisc reissue as the Encore Edition the best source for the film's audio, and even when compared to all other versions, it is noticeably better in areas, particularly when compared to the later Universal DVD and Blu-ray, which did do quite a bit of noise reduction, and those sound quite inferior to this version. This even sounds better than the Criterion UHD, which had a new attempt at cleaning up the audio and is thankfully better than the Universal DVD and Blu-ray, but still not as good as this version, which is basically the same source, but if you pretty much left it mostly alone. So this is the best presentation of the original mix and its best presentation on home video. So if you were to get any older version of Double Indemnity, it should be this Encore Edition reissue. And don't be fooled because it doesn't list digital sound anywhere. This is basically a digital sound repressing of the earlier discs, right down to having the frustrating no chapters except chapter 1 at the end of side 2 just to get to the trailer at the end of the film. So this is basically the exact same disc but with a tweaked cover to match the Encore styling, and it upgrades the sound to a digital PCM track, which makes this the best source for the film's audio to this day. I also think the reissue jacket, even though it's quite muted and we now have this strange sort of teal color and a sort of slight pinkish tint to the key art, I still think it's a much better looking jacket than having the green. I mean, they both have a sort of feel of older vintage video releases, but at least I think this jacket is an improvement as well. We did also receive a update on the VHS side of things. So there was a 1991 VHS reissue with updated artwork to match Universal releases of that time. Again, this is basically just a repressing of the original master, so this is basically a better tape quality in terms of it being a 1991 tape versus the original 1987 tape, still with the same source master and the mono and hi-fi. So I do think overall this is probably the best of the VHS tapes as well, but again, the Laserdisc is better in both picture and sound at this point, and this Encore reissue Laserdisc is really the best of the vintage video editions, and again, the best source of the film's original sound mix. The film did not see any updates for quite a while, which is common with a lot of Universal releases. They usually were stuck in the sort of Encore era for quite a bit, at least until the mid to late 90s, if not in the early days of DVD. So what happened with Double Indemnity was we finally did see a updated reissue on both tape and Laserdisc, but since it was coming to the early days of DVD and Universal was starting to handle things differently, these are very uncommon titles. So the VHS tape was released here in the US in 1998 with brand new updated artwork, which is going for a more modern feel, and they do try to brand it as a film noir title because they were at this point, like a lot of other studio labels, trying to come up with sort of miniature collections and brand certain titles as certain genres, which is appreciated, and I think the artwork looks quite nice. And since I haven't seen the 1998 versions, I can only assume this is the first iteration of their first major attempt at any sort of cleanup work, because the two 1998 releases and then the 2000 DVD were a sort of new attempt at going back to the elements and also looking at the audio. In addition, most 1990s VHS releases after we're really starting around the mid-90s especially, but especially from, say, 1994 on through 2000 and such, if you look at those compared to older releases, all the audio is frequently mastered significantly louder to the point of having clipping and things. So later VHS tape releases are usually not a great source for audio. And again, this does seem to be the same master that turned up on the DVD in 2000-2001, where they did try to play with the audio a bit and do their first sort of digital work or cleanup attempt. We did not get a Laserdisc upgrade because the format was ending and a lot of studios had already started jumping ship and changed their focus to DVD. So what happened was we did see a 1998 release of the film on Laserdisc, but only in Japan, and this was branded as part of the Billy Wilder collection that they were doing there, where individual Billy Wilder film releases were getting a special logo and things that we also saw here on an MGM DVD box set years later. But should you want the technical best presentation on Laserdisc, it will be the 1998 later release Japanese exclusive version. But again, I do think this is the same thing that turned up on the initial snapper case DVD just a couple years later, and I don't think the audio is quite as good as the relatively untouched versions previously. I've never gotten to look at this LD. I would like to at some point. It doesn't really pop up all that often, but again, this is just an example of a title getting a last Laserdisc release in Japan, because here in the US, Universal had kind of already changed their catalog focus and were revving up for DVD. So the film got a VHS release and then the Japanese Laserdisc, but then we didn't see a DVD for quite a while, and when we finally did, it turned up as the snapper case from Image Entertainment, who did handle a lot of early Universal titles, and they did produce them in snapper cases, which usually were, at least nice looking enough, and sometimes had a sort of gloss finish. So Double Indemnity came out as a Image DVD in this snapper case, seemingly from this 1998 master that turned up on VHS and Laserdisc, and was only in print for seemingly a short amount of time, and then I guess maybe due to the licensing or something, this Image DVD disappeared very quickly, and the film went out of print and was very expensive and difficult to get a copy of. I remember when I was growing up around this time, I just couldn't see the film for the longest time. And then when it would turn up on TCM, I could watch it. But, it was just random television airings or looking for an old VHS tape copy, because the DVD was absurdly expensive and out of print. And this lasted for a good number of years. So again, this DVD is not of super great quality because it's an early disc, and you do have lossy Dolby Digital Mono of the same master that turned up in 1998. So this is essentially the same DVD that Universal themselves would have put out, but they had licensed their DVDs to Image for catalog titles, and then I guess when that deal finished, Universal just didn't feel like doing their own DVD release of the film, and so from about 2001 up until when they finally did make a new master and DVD in 2006, it was very difficult to get a copy of the film. And of course, this was long before I was into Laserdisc, and so I searched everywhere trying to find a VHS tape that was in good shape, and I never did. So I really just had to rely on television broadcasts until we got the next go-around with the film, which honestly was the first major attempt at making something more along the lines of a special edition, which of course was done as part of their Legacy series in 2006. So here it is, the Universal Legacy release in the really actually quite nice hard case design they had for these. This is a 2-disc set with brand new supplements and extras, which form the bulk of the supplements on the 2 later releases. And this was also a brand new transfer and attempt at cleaning up the audio. So this was a brand new master from scratch compared to what, again, is basically the 1998 master. And we're still presumably working from the same copy of a fine grain done back in the 1980s. When you open this, we have 2 brand new discs with nice custom labels, and then the nice premium DVD disc trays. And then we have lovely custom imagery underneath for the disc trays, and they're all given this nice sort of sepia tint to match the overall design aesthetic. And it does have a nice premium feel to it. This is quite nice and hefty in the hands. It has some weight to it. And of course, have your TCM Universal DVD insert. So advertising TCM and, of course, Universal titles. So I remember purchasing this back when it came out at a Borders and being so excited that I could finally own a physical copy and that it had brand new extras. So again, this was a brand new master. It was far beyond what we had seen in terms of technical quality. But of course, when viewed now, a lot of the shortcomings are much more visible. And the audio was also brand new work done to the same pre-existing source. But this is where they first hit it with quite a lot of noise reduction, even more than what was before. And when you compare this to other releases, this is pretty much the one that really comes out on the bottom. And all of this work formed the basis of what was later upgraded to HD on the Blu-ray, like other Universal titles, like Touch of Evil, for example. Both Touch of Evil and Double Indemnity were basically 1080p versions of what the DVDs were. They may have gone back and done some new scans of the film elements, but all the work had been done for Double Indemnity on this 2006 set, and all the extras were just ported over, and then the Blu-ray also reused pretty much the same cover art design. But this is still a really nice example of the Universal Legacy series. It has a nice premium feel, and the overall packaging is still one of the best releases of the film. Not that it really has all that many with super good packaging. But this also is where you got the 2006 extras, which are all standard def, of course, but these are important because these have been ported over to the Universal Blu-ray, and then also most of them, but not all of them, have been ported over to the Criterion release. So we do have a brand new custom short Robert Osborne TCM intro. This is one of a handful that he recorded specifically for video releases. This has not been ported to the Criterion disc, unfortunately, but it's a nice bit of nostalgia for those of us who grew up watching the film on TCM and seeing the older TCM type studio and having an exclusive Robert Osborne intro. It's very short, but it's a huge burst of nostalgia. That, of course, is standard def. We have the lengthy Shadows of Suspense documentary with all the famous critics talking about the film, and it's lengthier. It's between 35 and 45 minutes, and it basically is your one-stop shopping for learning everything you need to know about the film in general, about its conception, production, changes from Kane's novel, Billy Wilder and Raymond Chandler writing the film, and then the production and release of the film, and the legacy afterwards. So it's one of the better DVD making of documentaries on a classic catalog title, and it's important it's been ported over many times because it really does a great job at covering all the bases. But like a lot of older standard def extras, later Blu-rays and UHDs don't necessarily encode them very well, and they don't upgrade the standard def files, so sometimes you're actually better off watching the original DVD and letting it be upscaled, because standard def extras usually don't look so hot on later reissues where they're just being ported over. Then we also got two brand new commentaries for this release. The first is with Richard Schickel, and of course that will immediately make most cinephiles who listen to commentaries groan, because we all talk about how usually Richard Schickel commentaries are terrible. But this one is probably the only decent one I've ever heard, in terms of he does seem to actually like the film, but I think that's more of because the film is universally accepted as one of the greatest films ever made, and he can't grumble about it too much. And he does have some good insights, although he says some things that really do make me groan and kind of make me wonder, does he not get the point? But, it's an okay commentary. It's solid. There are a number of gaps, and there is some describing the action on screen. But again, this is probably the only Richard Schickel commentary that I don't despise. So at least we did finally get a commentary. I wish it was better. I still don't think the film has a great commentary, but at least we had a solid one here. There's also a second commentary with Nick Redman, who founded the Twilight Time label, and the screenwriter Lim Dobbs. And they have a nice back and forth discussion about the film and the world of film noir in Los Angeles, and both of them also knew Billy Wilder. Dobbs knew him quite well, actually. He met with him many times as a young man, and even talked about how Wilder read some of his early scripts. So they have a lot of background with Billy Wilder and the film, and of course being career professionals in Los Angeles and seeing how the city has changed. And they have a long history with the film. So this is a really good commentary. In fact, I think overall it's better than the Schickel commentary. So at least we did finally get not just one, but two commentaries. And I think the first one is passable, and I think the second one is very good. But I still think the film has not gotten a definitive commentary, because both of these tracks do go on to other topics and don't stay 100% film focused. But it was really great to see the film finally get extras. And then disc 2 is the real interesting conundrum, because it is entirely devoted to the 1973 made-for-TV movie adaptation with Richard Crenna and Lee J. Cobb, where they basically redo the Chandler and Wilder Double Indemnity script, but it has no soul. And it's also in color, and it's made for television, and it's not good. It's very flat, and you can see the actors really trying, but it's a curiosity at best. I am glad that they did include it here, because it only underlines the fact that you can have the greatest script in the world, but it takes real genius to pick that up and make it move and give it energy. And even when you have actors saying the same dialogue, the spark is not there. And that's nothing against the actors who are really, really trying. And there's also many constraints for it being a made-for-TV movie. And there are some edits and some dialogue is tweaked a little bit. And also, it's taking place now in the 70s. So there's that weird disconnect of it being Double Indemnity, but it's a 1973 TV movie. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to anyone but the ultra curious, but it was a welcome addition to the film's supplements package. And it got its whole own DVD disc, so you didn't have to worry about compression problems. And of course, it's an older standard def file anyway in 4:3, so that's perfectly fine for a DVD disc. So this is where the TV movie version comes into play in terms of the supplements package. The film stayed like this for quite some time. There were some reissues with the same artwork that just removed the TV movie disc and were just a single DVD, but otherwise it was the exact same Legacy series disc. A lot of Universal titles that had legacy releases stayed that way for some time until they finally got an HD revisit. For Double Indemnity, it took a while because we had to wait all the way until 2014 to get the Blu-ray upgrade, which of course, again, reused the same key artwork design, but here in the first pressing has the nice limited edition slip box, which actually is embossed. If you look at one of these up close, there's embossing on some of the text on both the front and back, so that's a nice touch, but I still don't think it feels as premium as the Legacy series hard case DVD, but at least there was an attempt with both Double Indemnity and Touch of Evil in these first runs to give it a more premium feel. Again, this is basically a newer scan of the film elements, so it's a newer HD master, but the audio is pretty much the same as the DVD with some more attention paid to it, so it's had maybe a little bit more work done on it, and all of the supplements are carried over, and they're the same standard def files. So this is basically just a new picture master based on the same elements from a newer scan, but everything else is the 2006 DVD, even the audio, but that's been tweaked a little bit further. So basically what you're getting here is the 2006 DVD with HD picture that's been slightly improved, if that makes sense. So the film itself is in a standard Blu-ray case. This is what you'll find on regular releases and everything after the first pressing, because the actual physical extras were limited. So we have a standard universal disc, nothing else in here. So if you just have this standard Blu-ray, then you've just got the disc in a case. In addition to the outer slip case that's embossed and textured, on these limited versions, we got a universal archive packet with this nice sort of design, like it was a file pulled out of a cabinet at Universal. And so I really like these. It wasn't necessary, but it's a nice touch. But essentially inside we do have some printed art cards, essentially. So we have the original poster, which of course is iconic and is hardly ever used on releases of the film. And then of course the other side is blank. Then we have the lobby poster in the alternate aspect ratio, and then some lobby card reproductions. And most importantly, we have an image from the famous cut original ending of the film where it's the gas chamber sequence. So there are really only one or two stills that are floating around of this, and this is the one you see least often, and this is in nice higher quality. So usually when you see this, it's in really low quality or blurry looking. So this was a really nice touch, and of all of the art cards, this is the one that's really important. So that's the extras in the 2014 limited edition Blu-ray release of Double Indemnity, which again basically is all the 2006 working materials and standard def supplements ported over, including the TV movie, which is still standard def. And I don't think it looks as good as the original DVD due to how these are not always encoded very well. But basically they did do some new picture work. So the picture is the real improvement, But again, when looked at today, all of the surface flaws of it being a 2014 Universal Blu-ray and how they used to handle their catalog titles and over manipulate stuff, that really does come to the fore much more. And again, I think they were still primarily using that old fine grain copy at this point. Now, just before this, in about 2012 or so, in Region B for the UK market, Eureka Entertainment did do one of their Masters of Cinema title releases of Double Indemnity. And they did use the original poster artwork, and that art looks fantastic. And so I think that's the best artwork the film has ever had, because somebody finally realized, hey, this poster is great. Let's just use that. But they did port most of the Universal extras, but they were stuck using the Universal Master at the time. And it does seem like they basically just were able to include an HD version of the 2006 work with the same scrubbed 2006 audio. So basically, this US 2014 disc is the 2006 materials, but the audio is now lossless, and we do have a new picture master. But the slightly earlier Eureka Region B disc is literally an HD version of the 2006 release in both picture and sound. So technically, the 2014 Universal Blu-ray is better in picture, obviously, because it's newer work and a newer scan, a newer attempt at handling the picture. But the audio remains the same across all three, except it's been tweaked in different ways on each of the three. And unfortunately, none of them sound very good. But if you were curious about how the Eureka Region B version compares to the 2014 Universal Blu-ray, the Universal Blu-ray does have the better picture because it's a newer picture master. So that brings us all the way up to 2022, when the film finally got a new 4K master and was released by the Criterion Collection on a Blu-ray and UHD dual format combo release. So this has brand new artwork in the style Criterion is doing on a lot of classic black and white films, where they make basically a custom cover cobbled together out of images from the film or poster images. So this is in keeping with some of their other releases, such as High Sierra, and it looks quite nice. And we do have a version of the title font from the title card, which also carries over onto the spine. So it looks good. And I think the rear also, of course, keeps this aesthetic going. And this also continues for the interior with the booklet and the disc releases. So I think the artwork is good. I'm not the biggest fan of it, and if I had to choose the best artwork, I still think that's the Eureka release with the actual original poster art. But, I think all the Double Indemnity covers have looked good. I just like the supplements packages. I don't think the artwork has ever fully conveyed how this film is so iconic, and I still feel like the artwork and the supplements package hasn't been fully licked, in terms of really conveying the true iconic status of this film. But it's hard to do that anyway, because the film is that magical. So it's hard to get all of that into just a singular image. So I think the artwork is solid and good here. This is done in the same way Criterion does their dual format releases. We have two Blu-rays on the main side with the sort of stacked disc hub, and then you take out the booklet to reveal the UHD. And I like how they've kept images that seem pulled right out of the main titles on the disc, so that is a nice touch. Unfortunately, due to the way these cases are, when you get them, usually they will have floater discs, because the discs do come off the hubs in shipping. And thankfully mine weren't scratched up or anything, but you should open these and check them when you get them, because they do get floater discs, and UHDs are much more susceptible to playback issues if you get scratches, so you do want to check that. My issue was not disc damage, thankfully, but I did have an issue with the booklet, which, if you can tell, is actually warped. Like, it got wet, or it had moisture at some point get on it, and it unfortunately has this warping effect. Now, this is something that happens sometimes, but between this and floater discs and different things, it does seem that Criterion's quality control in the packaging department has very much taken a nosedive. So essentially what I'm saying is, you should definitely open your Criterion releases when you purchase them to just check and make sure everything's okay, because you don't want to stick it on the shelf and open it 6 months later and find you have a scratched up UHD disc. So unfortunately, this is not a stapled booklet. It is one of Criterion's fold out affairs, and the essay is quite long. So you've got this, and then you have to flip it over because again the essay is quite extensive. And the restoration notes, which give the all-important clues about the previous fine-grain copy source, are just tucked away here on this little paragraph and almost treated like an afterthought, unfortunately. It was great that we did get a new essay, and again, it is quite lengthy, which is good. But I have to say, I'm kind of I don't exactly know what the author was getting after in terms of they don't really talk a whole lot about the film after a certain point, and the actual approach they seem to be taking is a bit perplexing in regards to this film not really having a lot of that. I have seen some other discussion online about people kind of wondering about what this essay was exactly trying to say. So I'm glad it's not just me who feels that way, because I've read this several times and it is longer in terms of Criterion essays, and I'm still kind of perplexed as to what point it was trying to make, actually. So I do wish that this had a fuller booklet and had a lot of different pieces and things. Of course, this being Double Indemnity, I wish it had an indicator-sized book because, you know, Double Indemnity deserves that, but at least we did get a new write-up on the film, although I don't think it's a particularly good one, and I would have preferred an actual stapled booklet, or at the very least a booklet that was not warped from the factory in terms of like somebody just spilled a bunch of water on it and let it dry this way. So this is a brand new 4K master, the subject of a new restoration that did have to mix sources. The main source was held at the BFI, and it is a composite fine-grained source, so that was borrowed and used as the bulk of the new restoration, as it was better quality than the other source we've been seeing all these years, which is that old copy of a fine-grained source and was labeled a safety dupe negative, and that original source that was copied back in 86 or so has deteriorated or is gone. So that copy that seemingly was used for all of the video releases was used to basically plug in gaps and fill holes and spots where the British element was too far gone. And also apparently the British element did have a lot of shrinkage, so it was an element they had to do a lot of work on, but they also had to use the second source to patch in. So what this means, of course, as on past releases, which we're used to, we're not coming from an original negative source. There is degradation built into the image, and we do have to deal with the source limitations. But here, because we have primarily a better element than what we're used to seeing, that does give a dramatic visual improvement over past releases, in addition to it being a new 4K master with much more careful attention paid to contrast and grading. And also, we have HDR in the form of Dolby Vision on the UHD. And thankfully, Criterion is good at handling HDR, especially in comparison to, say, for example, when they license a title from Warner Brothers, who the Warner Studio label is usually pretty bad about HDR, and also the Universal Studio label also has HDR on catalog titles that is a bit much at times and has some of that dreaded pop-out effect in areas in terms of brightness. So thankfully, this does not have any of those issues, and I think this has been handled about the best it possibly could due to the source limitations. The HDR is a refinement on everything, but it never allows things to become too bright in parts of the image. It basically is an enhancement of, or allowing more breathing room for the source to have more visual nuance, and basically you're just running into the source limitations in terms of what we have to work from. So do keep in mind there are source limitations. You are going to see fleeting bits of damage and fluctuation and maybe a scratch or a tiny hair poking in here and there, but that's unfortunately baked into the best surviving sources we have. But ultimately, even if you're just looking at the standard Blu-ray, this is a lightning leap forward over the 2014 Universal disc, and especially over the 2006 DVD and the Eureka Blu-ray. So this is one of the must upgrade titles and one of the must own Criterion UHD Blu-ray combo releases just for the transfer specs alone. This is a brand new overhaul, and again, I think it's been done about the best that can be on the restoration side of things, and the disc release has been handled well. Criterion's encoding practices, I'm not too big on, but on the UHD front, they are at least usually pretty solid, and again, with the source limitations, there's not necessarily a whole lot that you can do, but very thankfully, the Dolby Vision HDR is very tastefully done, and this is an example of how a catalog title should be handled when you've got limited source elements and you try to apply HDR to those. Now, on the audio side of things, it's basically the same situation as we have on Criterion's release of Citizen Kane on UHD. It is a brand new transfer of the audio source and a brand new restoration attempt, and it is thankfully better than the previous Universal releases. It has far less noise reduction and things, but it does have some, and it does have some EQing of the sound. So basically, I'd say this is probably the second best sounding version, if you count all of the initial tape and Laserdisc releases as one main version, with the digital sound reissue being the best in terms of the Laserdisc. So I would say this is the best sounding version outside of the original late 80s, early 90s releases, where they basically didn't mess with the audio that much. If you just listen to this release, it's going to sound very good. If you compare it to the past Universal DVD and Blu-ray and the Eureka Blu-ray, it's going to sound significantly better than those. But if you compare it to the digital soundtrack on the 1991 Laserdisc, this is very much inferior, particularly in the fullness of the dialogue and the music cues, and you can tell that some work has been done and it just doesn't sound as lively and full-bodied, and we are talking about a limited audio source, so you need as much of that as you can. So they should have really left it alone. There is no reason to do what they did outside of just trying to make it sound cleaner and more appropriate for modern ears, I guess, if you will. But it's really unfortunate that we still don't have the best sounding audio of the film on the modern restored version. So this is like Citizen Kane, where the Criterion UHD is a nice attempt and the best version we've had in a long while, but it's still not as good as the relatively untouched, best sounding older release versions on older formats. So for Double Indemnity, the 1991 Laserdisc is still the best sounding release by far. It certainly edges out the Criterion audio, so I do think you need to at least supplement this Criterion release with the 1991 Laserdisc or one of the other VHS or Laserdisc releases from 1987 to the 1991 period. But again, the Laserdisc with the PCM audio is the best choice. Then we turn to the extras, which are all contained on the Blu-rays except for the commentary. Now, while this does port over most of the materials from the Universal releases, it doesn't port over all of them. Criterion has added some new supplements, but there are some things lost from the past releases, which means you need to hang on to those. So I would say you really need to have three versions: the Criterion UHD, the 1991 Laserdisc for the best audio, and either the 2006 DVD, the Eureka Blu-ray, or the 2014 Universal Blu-ray for those specific extras. So here we have the Richard Schickel audio commentary that's been ported over, but Criterion did not port over the Nick Redman and Lim Dobbs commentary, so that's still exclusive to the old Universal releases. And again, I do think it's a better commentary than the Schickel one, so that was... I don't know if it's a licensing thing, but I think it's more of just they didn't want to have two commentaries, because I've seen Criterion even do this with some of their old Laserdisc commentaries, where they'll port, such as Cat People, they ported the Greg Mank Warner DVD commentary, but they didn't port their own Bruce Eder Laserdisc commentary that was done for their Criterion release in 1994. So it's kind of hit or miss, but it's a real shame that we don't have the better commentary here, but at least they ported one. But there's no new commentary, so that's really unfortunate. I had hoped that they would get a critic to come in and do the best, an actual commentary fully focused on the film that really covered all the bases, and that didn't happen. So unfortunately, I don't think there's still a definitive Double Indemnity track, but at least we have one here. We have a brand new piece with Noah Eisenberg, who wrote the book Billy Wilder on Assignment. This is the best of the new extras on here in terms of new ones made for this release, and he discusses Billy Wilder's life and career, his journey to America, his entry into Hollywood, working his way up as a screenwriter, partnering with Charles Brackett, and then getting to Double Indemnity. So this is a great crash course in the early years and career of Billy Wilder, and will provide incredible insight into the film for those who don't know too much about Wilder's early years. Then we have one of Criterion's newer style conversations between critics, which of course is between the Tsar of Noir, Eddie Muller, and Imogen Sarah Smith. They have a nice sort of loose conversation about the film. Again, I think it was shot still around COVID and such, so they're in different areas and they're intercut. But it's a nice conversation. It's a nice extra to have, but they also discuss things that are covered in other places. And again, I would have rather just had an actual new commentary, but at least this is a nice, lengthy, good, solid conversation. But you see Criterion's encoding pop up here in terms of, for all their talking head bits, they usually just don't worry about how compressed they are. So if you notice things like compression artifacts, you'll see them all over the background in terms of, that's just something Criterion does. And I do find that a bit distracting. It's much more obvious when you're watching on a 4K television and it's upscaling, but still, you will notice that in this piece. We get the Shadows of Suspense documentary, the 2006 piece from the DVD, still in standard def, and it looks okay, but it's obviously just the same files copied over. This is still the best overall extra on the film, and basically covers all the bases that you want to know, and so it's great that's been ported here. Again, it's a bit lengthier than most DVD extras. Then we have the original trailer, which unfortunately has not been restored and is still standard def and is just upscaled here and doesn't look so good, but at least it's here. We have 2 vintage radio adaptations from 1945 and 1950, which are fascinating to look at and study the actual adapted versions, but they are, of course, lossy Dolby Digital only. The real draw is, of course, Blu-ray Disc 2 being entirely devoted to the Volker Schlorndorff, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, documentary, Billy, How Did You Do It?, which is a multi-part, multi-hour essentially intimate conversation with Wilder, which is, of course, every single second and frame of this is priceless. And for those who haven't seen this before, this is an absolute goldmine of getting Billy Wilder talking about his career straight from the horse's mouth, almost as if you're in the room with the legendary artist himself and just being able to soak it all in. So it's very much one of those things that you put on and you're just sitting there for 3 hours and you just watch it start to finish. But it is broken up into parts should you wish to break it up. But it's a priceless treasure. I'm not sure what it was originally shot on. I think maybe film or perhaps video or a mix, but this is an older source, and it looks solid and okay, but the length is why the whole second Blu-ray is devoted to it. Otherwise, this would have been just a single Blu-ray and UHD title. But it's great we do finally have this on an American release, as before it was only on the Eureka Region B release of The Lost Weekend, which is why that release was so important. But now we finally have it here. It's been given its own Blu-ray disc for space, and it's a great inclusion. Of course, that means you also lose the TV movie version of Double Indemnity. So if you want that, you have to hang on to the Universal releases, and you don't have the little 90-second Robert Osborne intro that was recorded for those. So there are a number of reasons to hang on to the older Universal versions. So it's a shame Criterion couldn't include all of that material as well. So overall, I think this is a solid upgrade. It's a fantastic upgrade in terms of the picture, but the audio still isn't as good as the Laserdisc, but thankfully it is better than the past Universal releases. The new extras are good, and we do get the full-length Billy, How Did You Do It? Multi-part documentary, which is essential, so it's great to finally have that on a US release. But again, we do lose extras from the Universal releases, and overall, I just wish this was a more comprehensive package. It just feels like it could have used a third disc in terms of another disc of supplements like Citizen Kane, because this is Double Indemnity. It is one of the most beloved and critically worshipped and analyzed films of the entire Hollywood studio system, let alone the films of the 1940s. So it's definitely a film I think that still hasn't gotten its full appreciation on video, but thankfully the Criterion release does correct a lot of the issues of the past and has a good overall supplements package and a good overall presentation and the best picture quality we've ever seen. But again, I guess my biggest issue here is that the audio still is not as good as the old releases where they pretty much left it alone. So basically, this is an example where the Criterion version does about everything you'd want it to, except for keeping all of the old extras, but it does fall short in the audio. So you basically have to capture your Laserdisc and then sync it and remux it to the Criterion version to have the best picture and the best sound on physical media. So that is the overall video history of Double Indemnity from the initial Universal releases in 1987 all the way up to the 2022 Criterion, Blu-ray, and UHD combo release of the new 4K restoration. So it is at least a little bit easier to follow in terms of there aren't as many releases, but along the way there were several milestones in terms of new masters or new attempts at cleaning the film up, and while the picture got better and better and better, it was the audio that suffered, which unfortunately is a problem on most catalog titles. But thankfully, of the limited sources that are available, we do finally have a great picture master out there on the Criterion release with lovely new extras and most of the old ones, and the audio is thankfully better than the past couple releases. But again, you do have to supplement the Criterion UHD with the 1991 Laserdisc for the best audio and one of the older Universal releases for those exclusive extras that Criterion did not port over. So with those three releases, whichever versions you pick, you will have the best picture, the best sound, and all of the supplements produced for North American video releases. So as always, I hope my babblings about Double Indemnity, film noir, and physical media have been at least somewhat fun and informative. Please do keep supporting both studio and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.